Adam Wallace had spent most of his life building things: gardens, driveways, stone walls that outlasted marriages, retaining walls that kept homes from sliding into rivers, and patios that families would sit on long after he was gone. He was a landscape contractor by trade, a practical man with tanned, weathered hands, the kind of man who measured his time not by weeks or months, but by the maturity of trees he planted. Now, nearing 60 and newly semi-retired, Adam had finally made a move he had put off for years. He left the city and relocated to a quiet edge of a small Pacific Northwest town where the air smelled like cedar mulch and diesel in the mornings. He bought a house with thick bones and a long gravel driveway that wound through a sloped patch of land he intended to bring back to life. It was his first real investment in peace, in ownership, and in control over his environment, something he hadn't truly had since before his divorce or the slow fading of his construction company in the wake of cheaper, faster competition. The house was nothing grand. 2 stories, wooden siding, a metal roof that sang during rain, and windows that let in the deep gold of evening light. But the land was what had sold him. Nearly an acre, bordered by low stonework left by a previous owner, with an overgrown orchard to one side and a neglected path that once may have led to a shed or maybe a chicken coop. The driveway was his pride. 40 yards of compacted gravel, edged with river rock and flanked by a pair of old oaks that he'd trimmed himself. It curved just slightly off the main road and ended in a rounded clearing in front of the garage, making it abundantly clear that the land, the approach, and the access were his and his alone. The property had no through traffic, no sidewalk, and no ambiguity. The deed had been clear, and Adam made sure to check the survey twice. It was private land. His land. For the first few months, life there was almost uneventful. Quiet in the best way. He hauled brush, took his time reshaping the sloped front yard into terraced beds, and quietly ignored the overly friendly but insistent neighborhood chat group that someone had added him to without permission. He knew the type, block-by-block cheerleaders who used emojis like punctuation and treated every holiday like a production. Adam didn't dislike people, but he certainly didn't need them crowding his routine. He'd wave when needed, say good morning when appropriate, and otherwise keep to himself. A man earning his space didn't owe anyone anything. Then came the day he first saw her, Karen, waddling confidently up his driveway with the kind of certainty reserved for people who believe rules are for others. It was a Wednesday morning, overcast with low marine fog still hugging the treetops, and Adam had just finished watering his roses. Karen was not alone. She was pulling a wagon with a stack of neon-colored plastic chairs and 2 small kids, twins maybe, or close, trailing behind her, swinging lunch bags like toys. She wore a large, floppy hat and a shirt that read, "World's Best Boy Mom," in glittery font. Without so much as a pause, she passed the edge of his driveway, nodded at him as if they were on speaking terms, and called out, "Just a quick shortcut through your lot. School traffic's nuts." Adam, perplexed but not yet irritated, raised a hand and replied with a flat, "Actually, it's private access." Karen didn't stop. She didn't slow down. In fact, she laughed. "Oh, it's fine. Everyone uses it. You'll get used to it." And just like that, she disappeared down the hill toward the street beyond. That had been a month ago. What followed were a series of increasingly baffling, boundary-pushing encounters. Children cutting through his yard during recess hours from the school up the road. Teenagers biking across the gravel without helmets, leaving tire ruts and littered. Snack wrappers. A neighbor in an SUV casually parked half on his lawn while chatting on the phone. When Adam tried to speak up, calmly, rationally, he was met with confused faces and casual dismissal. "Oh, Karen said you were okay with it," someone told him. Another shrugged and said, "We thought this was shared access. It's not gated or anything." He considered installing a gate then, even priced one, but he hated the idea of fencing himself in to compensate for other people's entitlement. Instead, he added signs, clear, courteous ones. Private driveway, no public access. They were torn down within 2 days. One was covered in pink spray paint. Another simply vanished. And now came the weekend that would ignite everything. Adam had woken up early on Saturday to the sound of bass thudding in the distance, muffled, rhythmic, and intrusive. It was the kind of noise you could feel through the floorboards. He got dressed slowly without rushing, not yet knowing what awaited him, and walked down the stairs with the kind of calm that comes from years of having handled dozens of logistical crises in his working life. But when he stepped out onto the porch, coffee in hand, what he saw pulled the breath right out of him. A full-scale inflatable bounce house sat squarely in the center of his driveway, lime green with cartoonish purple turrets, staked deep into the gravel with orange straps. Folding tables flanked its edges, lined with pink and blue cupcakes. Balloons were zip-tied to the oaks. A woman he recognized, Karen unmistakably, stood near the center with a clipboard and a headset mic, directing a delivery driver as if she were hosting a county fair. Cars, 6, maybe 7, were parked haphazardly along the edge of his lawn and right up the shoulder of his drive, effectively blocking any exit or entrance. Adam stood frozen. Not with fear, but with disbelief. The kind that makes you squint at the scene before you as if your eyes might be deceiving you. Karen turned, spotted him, and lit up with a smile too wide to be anything but theatrical. She approached with a bounce in her step, gesturing with open arms like they were co-conspirators. "Good morning, neighbor. Big day for Tyler. His 9th birthday. I knew you'd be okay with it. We just needed a little extra room, and your driveway was perfect. You weren't using it anyway, right?" Adam blinked once. "You set this up on my land, without asking." Karen tilted her head, unfazed. "It's just one day. We'll be gone by evening. You're welcome to join. We've got sliders, music. Oh, and someone brought their golden retriever puppies. It's all very family-friendly." He didn't move. "You're blocking my access. I need to leave." Karen laughed again, this one high-pitched and lightly mocking. "Don't be such a grump. Just for today, okay? Be a sport. It's for the kids." And just like that, she turned away. For a moment, Adam considered going back inside and ignoring the madness entirely. But no, he couldn't. Not because of ego or pride, or a desire for revenge, because this was something different now. This wasn't just annoying neighbors. This was someone deliberately, confidently crossing a boundary, looking him in the eye and declaring, "You don't matter." And Adam Wallace had built too many things, endured too much silence, and paid too much for that gravel driveway to let someone like Karen rewrite the rules. He took a slow breath, turned back into the house, and closed the door, not with defeat, but with intent. He had some calls to make. Adam didn't react with shouting or threats, not because he lacked the anger, but because experience had taught him that in these situations, raised voices were like fuel on brush fire. They created smoke, noise, and zero resolution. He sat down in his kitchen, opened his worn leather notebook, and methodically began listing what he observed, noting the time, the number of cars, and even a vague description of the woman wearing a sequin tracksuit who had just taken a folding chair and dragged it halfway into his rose bed. This wasn't paranoia. This was documentation. Decades in contracting had taught him the value of evidence. What mattered in disputes was never who screamed the loudest, but who had the paper to back them up. Outside, the bounce house wheezed and bellowed with each jolt from the jumping children, and music had started blaring through a Bluetooth speaker duct-taped to one of the stakes. The lyrics were barely discernible, but the bass thumped relentlessly. Adam stared at the mess from behind his window, jaw clenched, and watched as one of the party guests, an overweight man in flip-flops and a tank top, reached into the cooler, cracked open a beer, and proceeded to relieve himself behind Adam's azalea. Bushes. That was enough. He picked up the phone and called the non-emergency police line. He wasn't unreasonable. He wasn't looking for a brawl. But this was now a matter of trespassing, unauthorized use of private property, and obstruction. He explained everything calmly to the dispatcher, giving names where he could, and describing the scene in detail. She sounded young, polite, and slightly overwhelmed. "We'll send someone when a unit is free," she said after typing for a while. "It may take some time. It's a busy weekend." Adam thanked her, hung up, and sat in his living room, watching as more guests arrived. About 40 minutes later, the bounce house began to tip slightly. A group of children had jumped too wildly on one end and knocked loose one of the stakes. It collapsed partially, and while no one was hurt, the resulting panic sent 2 kids screaming and a woman, Karen herself, stumbling out with her headset askew, barking into her phone. She seemed more annoyed than concerned, more focused on who had messed up the schedule than whether someone had been injured. The party began to lose structure. Cupcakes smeared across folding tables, balloons tangled in the oak branches, and the speaker shorted out after someone spilled juice on it. Even as the chaos mounted, no one made any effort to clear the driveway or remove the vehicles blocking Adam's path. When the police finally arrived, an hour and 20 minutes after his initial call, it was one officer in a city patrol car, a young man who looked barely out of academy. He stepped out of his vehicle and approached the crowd like a substitute teacher walking into the last day of school. Karen was on him before he even made it to the driveway, smiling, gesturing, and explaining something rapidly with both hands. Adam waited patiently on the porch, arms crossed. After a few minutes, the officer came over. "Mr. Wallace?" he asked, glancing down at his tablet. "Yes." "I'm Officer Denby. We've got kind of a complicated situation here. There seems to be some confusion about property lines." "There's no confusion," Adam interrupted, his tone firm but controlled. "This is a private driveway. The land is legally mine. I have the deed, survey, and property line markings." "Right, I get that," Denby said, shifting slightly. "Karen, Mrs. Longmire, claims there's a shared access agreement?" "There isn't." "Okay. I'm not in a position to make that legal determination on the spot. But would you mind if I suggested they move the party off the driveway and wrap it up early? That might be the easiest way forward." Adam didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout. He simply said, "They are trespassing. My driveway is obstructed. I called you to enforce that." Denby sighed. "I hear you. But unless you're looking to press charges right now, I can't remove them without escalation. I'm trying to de-escalate." Adam paused. The young officer's words were clear. If he pressed charges, this could escalate into arrests, maybe news coverage, certainly drama. And while Karen's event was in full decay anyway, he could see what she was doing now, standing a few feet away, arms crossed, watching him, daring him to push harder. She had turned the entire fiasco into a test. How far could she go before he broke? How much could she take before he'd try to take it back? He didn't press charges. Instead, he walked back into his house, retrieved a laminated copy of his property deed and the surveyor's map, returned, and handed it to Officer Denby. "Please record that I formally notified you of my property rights and of my intention to seek restitution if further trespass occurs." The officer nodded, took a photo of the documents with his tablet, and returned to Karen. Words were exchanged. Faces changed. Karen's voice rose for a moment, then dropped. The bounce house began to deflate. An hour later, the cars were gone, the folding tables packed up, and only the muddy tire marks and crushed petals on his lawn remained. No apology came. Not a glance. Nothing. Karen had retreated behind her white vinyl fence without so much as a word, but Adam knew this was only the beginning. He felt it. In the indifference of the officer, the defiance in Karen's eyes, and the silence from the neighbors who had stood there and watched. It was all a message. She didn't need permission. She'd just take it. The next morning, Adam stepped outside and found a flyer rubber-banded to his mailbox. It read, Community meeting, next Thursday, 7 p.m. Discussion, shared access and community use of private drives. Location, Karen Longmire's residence. There was no mistake. She wasn't backing down. She was organizing. And Adam Wallace knew one thing for certain. If he didn't act now, the next time, it wouldn't just be a bounce house. It would be policy. It would be precedent. It would be his land in name only. It was time to plan carefully, quietly, but this time with teeth. The week leading up to the so-called community meeting was one of silence, not peace. Adam went about his routine like a man under quiet siege. He trimmed the edges of his garden beds, repaired the flattened corner of his front lawn, and power-washed the tire marks off the gravel with the same precision he used to apply when cutting limestone. But the air around him had changed. It wasn't the noise that lingered. It was the absence of acknowledgement. People passed by with studied neutrality. The usual neighbor who nodded while walking his dog suddenly kept his eyes down. A woman who used to wave from her porch now turned inside when Adam stepped out. They weren't hostile, but they weren't innocent either. Karen had clearly begun shaping a narrative in her favor, and whether through social pressure, confusion, or cowardice, others had quietly chosen to sit on her side of the seesaw. Adam had no intention of attending the meeting at Karen's house. He already knew what it was. Not a forum, not a dialogue, but a carefully curated stage for her to present a case built on false familiarity and fabricated community need. She would position herself as the voice of reason, the guardian of family values, the champion of collective interest. He would be cast as the outlier, the grumpy man at the end of the street who said no to children, no to progress, no to neighbors. She would be pleasant and firm, smiling as she twisted the facts. She wouldn't need to say anything overtly aggressive. She would let implication and performance do the work. Instead, Adam sent his attorney. He had quietly retained one the Monday after the party, a former land use specialist named Meredith Jordan, recommended by a contact he still had from his contracting days. She wasn't theatrical. She didn't speak in grand promises or passionate outbursts. She was detail-driven, calm, and unshakable, the kind of professional who understood that paper was stronger than noise. Meredith attended the meeting alone and took notes, refusing to speak unless addressed directly, which predictably didn't happen. The following day, she delivered a summary that read more like a tactical debriefing than a community discussion. According to her, Karen had claimed the event had been accidentally relocated to Adam's driveway due to last-minute school maintenance, an assertion not supported by any real evidence. She further suggested that the street lacked adequate communal space for family-oriented activities, and hinted at a future petition to create a public-use easement across several properties, including Adam's, to address the imbalance. Karen used words like underutilized frontage and neighbor-friendly pathways, framing the discussion as a public good. Not once did she mention the police, the deflation of the bounce house, or the prior warnings Adam had issued. One attendee had raised concerns about trespassing, but Karen quickly dismissed it as an unfortunate misunderstanding already resolved amicably. It was all smoke and sweetness, but beneath the tone, it was a clear opening salvo. Karen wasn't retreating. She was expanding. 2 days later, Adam received a letter delivered by certified mail and signed by a land development consultant named Barry Reichman, stating that the town's zoning board had received a community use inquiry regarding a shared access proposal affecting his property. The letter included polite bureaucratic phrasing, phrases like exploratory request and preliminary assessment. But the implication was serious. Karen had formally petitioned the town to assess his driveway for potential inclusion in a local connectivity initiative, which, if pushed, could snowball into a conditional easement proceeding. Adam didn't panic. He didn't march down to City Hall and slam his fist on a desk. Instead, he gathered every document he had: title, survey, aerial photos from Google Earth spanning 10 years, even his original correspondence with the real estate agency when purchasing the home. He forwarded it all to Meredith, who began assembling a formal response to preempt the inquiry from becoming an actual petition. But while Meredith worked the legal angles, Adam knew the pressure campaign wasn't coming solely from the municipal side. Karen escalated through optics. By the following weekend, Adam's driveway had become a symbol. He noticed small things at first: kids on scooters slowing down as they passed, parents standing nearby as if subtly reasserting their presence on what they still imagined to be public ground. Then came the chalk drawings, crude pastel doodles appearing on the outermost edge of his gravel, hearts and rainbows drawn right to the property line. Not quite on his land, but close enough to raise a brow. Then came the flyers, again rubber-banded to mailboxes, announcing a summer family block fun day, hosted by neighborhood families for open streets, complete with pony rides and a food truck. Adam's address wasn't listed, but the map on the back clearly showed the entrance point as Gravel Access, corner of Wallace Residence. He went to City Hall that Monday. Not to yell, not to argue, but to file a formal declaration with notarized documents affirming his ownership of the driveway and requesting that any proposed use or encroachment be immediately communicated to him and his legal representative. The clerk, a tired-looking man named Ray, read through Adam's packet, nodded slowly, and said, "You're not the first one to deal with this kind of thing. Happens more than you'd think." "You mean the parties?" Adam asked. Ray shook his head. "No. I mean people trying to turn private land into common land by being loud enough, long enough." That evening, Adam walked the entire length of his property with a measuring wheel and a can of landscaping paint. He remarked the boundary lines in visible white arcs, refreshing the old marks that had faded with weather and wear. He drove in reflective markers at intervals, just like he used to on job sites, and placed a second sign at the start of his driveway, sturdier than the last, this time fixed into concrete footing. It read, "Private property. No access without written permission. Trespassing enforced." The next morning, it was gone. Not knocked over, not broken, gone. In its place was a laminated sheet of paper zip-tied to one of the oaks. It featured a cartoon smiling sun and the words, "Let's keep our streets friendly. Share the space." Adam didn't even blink. He took photos, emailed them to Meredith, and filed a police report, not just for vandalism but for tampering with posted legal signage. He added security cameras to the front porch and the driveway entrance, subtle but precise, with motion detection and night vision. He wasn't interested in confrontation. He was interested in record. By now, Karen wasn't acting alone. Her campaign had infected the street. A neighbor he barely knew approached him while Adam was pruning the hedges and said, "You know, it really wouldn't kill you to let the kids through. Just during the day, you've got all that space." Adam didn't respond. He didn't need to. The man eventually turned and walked away. It wasn't about space. It was about ownership. It was about precedent, about control. And Adam Wallace had worked too long, lost too much, and paid too dearly for peace to let someone else claim it just because she smiled while stealing. This was no longer a misunderstanding. It was a siege. A cold one. Slow and polite and layered in excuses. But it was war all the same, and Adam was done watching. The tipping point came not with noise, but with a letter. It arrived on a Wednesday morning, tucked into a plain manila envelope with a generic pre-printed return address from a municipal planning liaison's office. At first glance, Adam assumed it was a formality. Another mailed notice acknowledging his prior filings or perhaps an update on the status of the unauthorized event reports he'd submitted. But when he opened it and read through the dense, carefully worded paragraphs, a slow burn crept across his chest. It was not a formality. It was a preliminary review request formal and logged regarding the potential reassignment of usage classification for his driveway, citing consistent informal community use and neighbor-established passage norms as contributing factors to a proposed review of zoning adaptability. He reread the language twice, trying to absorb the bureaucratic coldness of it. The phrasing wasn't overtly accusatory, but it was insidious. A suggestion that because his land had been repeatedly encroached upon without his consent, it now potentially qualified for shared designation under community enhancement bylaws. There was no legal ruling yet, but the letter included a date for a preliminary hearing, an open municipal session where residents could voice support or concern over the proposal. Adam understood immediately what this was. Karen hadn't stopped at social influence or neighborhood charm offensives. She'd taken the next logical step, framing his land as already communal through repetition, casual use, and strategic visibility, until the system itself began to view it as such. It was land by attrition, theft through normalization. He called Meredith that same hour and forwarded her the document. She reviewed it in silence for several minutes before speaking. "This isn't just about the driveway anymore," she said. "If this review goes through and no one objects effectively, it opens the door for easement designation. That's hard to reverse once established. We need hard counters, formal witness statements, photographic history, documented refusals. And we'll need to show that the so-called usage was against your will and your interest. Otherwise, they'll paint you as complicit by inaction." Adam nodded, already scanning through his files. He had pictures, dates, video, but he also needed community support, and that's where the real challenge lay. Most of the neighbors were either indifferent or quietly aligned with Karen's narrative. Some, no doubt, believed it truly was about the children, about family, about something wholesome and harmless. But Adam wasn't going to argue philosophy. He was going to argue property and facts. He began knocking on doors, not with petitions, not with hostility, but with quiet, deliberate purpose. At the first house, a couple in their 60s answered. Adam politely asked if they recalled when the community started using his driveway as a cut-through. The woman shifted uncomfortably, glancing at her husband, who finally said, "We don't really pay attention. Karen told us the route was always shared." Adam thanked them and left. At the next house, a younger man answered, "Earbuds still in?" He barely listened. "I'm not getting involved in neighborhood drama, man," he said, closing the door mid-sentence. But not all doors were closed. One woman, Elise, early 40s, rarely seen but always polite, invited him in. She remembered when Adam moved in, how well kept the property was, and how she had always assumed the driveway was private. She admitted Karen had pressured people into signing a statement about community improvements. But Elise hadn't signed. She didn't like how fast it all moved. Adam asked if she'd be willing to give a written statement. She agreed. One by one, he found a few more, quiet residents who had stayed out of the spotlight but were willing to support him if asked directly and respectfully. Not a majority, not an overwhelming show of force, but enough to counter the illusion of total unity Karen had so carefully cultivated. Meredith compiled these statements, attached them to the timeline of property ownership and posted notices, and began preparing a presentation for the upcoming hearing. The turning point came 2 days before the hearing itself. Adam returned home to find an official white pickup truck parked partially across his driveway. A man in a reflective vest stood beside it, clipboard in hand, surveying something in the gravel. Adam stepped out of his truck, approached him, and asked what he was doing. The man explained calmly and with no sense of urgency that he was there on behalf of a third-party contracting firm doing preliminary site assessments for the town's planning board. "For what purpose?" Adam asked, already knowing the answer. "Just mapping potential pedestrian-friendly zoning corridors," the man replied, gesturing vaguely. "Nothing's been approved. We're just doing our rounds." Adam stood there, staring at the clipboard. "This is private property," he said flatly. The man didn't flinch. "We were told it's under review. That gives us access for assessment." "Not without permission." The man shrugged, made a note, and left without protest. Adam documented the interaction, took photos of the vehicle's plates, and immediately sent everything to Meredith. She was livid. "They're acting like this is a formality, like it's already happening. That's not just disrespectful. It's strategy. They want to plant the image that this change is inevitable. If we don't strike that down hard at the hearing, they'll use silence and precedent to finish the job." Adam didn't sleep much that night. He sat in his office, surrounded by papers, watching the security footage from the previous weeks. There, in grainy black and white, he watched Karen's guests walk through his drive, watched delivery trucks pull into his turnaround and idle for minutes, watched children run up and down the gravel like it was a sidewalk, watched himself, standing silently on the porch, unwilling to escalate but slowly being cornered. He realized what Karen had done wasn't loud or violent or even illegal. It was slow erosion. She made him question how much he was willing to tolerate in the name of civility, and while he hesitated, she acted. But tomorrow, he wouldn't hesitate. He'd show up. He'd speak, not in anger, not in desperation, but with ownership. Not just of the land, but of the right to draw a line and defend it. And that was when the shift happened. It wasn't in the paperwork. It wasn't in the laws. It was in him. This wasn't a matter of peace anymore. It was a matter of identity, of boundaries, literal and personal. And Adam Wallace had found his threshold. The hearing did not go how Karen had imagined, and that was the problem. Adam arrived precisely on time, not early, not late, walking with the calmness of someone who had nothing left to prove but everything to defend. He was dressed plainly, carrying a folder and a quiet intensity that silenced the mild rustling in the room as he stepped inside. Meredith sat beside him, composed and exact, opening her binder and arranging exhibits with the detached precision of someone sharpening scalpels. The community center was filled beyond usual attendance. Retirees in loose-knit sweaters, young couples with babies strapped to their chests, 2 teenage boys pretending to be bored but clearly curious. At the front, a panel of planning officials sat at a folding table draped in a navy cloth that didn't quite cover the metal legs. Karen was there, of course, seated confidently 2 rows forward, flanked by a couple of her louder supporters. The kind of people who insert themselves into homeowner groups because it gives them something to do with their dissatisfaction. She smiled when Adam entered, but her eyes didn't. The session began with formalities, procedural outlines, then the presentation of the shared access proposal. The language was polished and ambiguous, heavy on idealism and light on substance. Diagrams were shown, carefully edited overhead views of the street, digitally rendered pathways, trees made slightly greener than in real life, property lines rendered translucent as if public use was already a gentle fact rather than an aggressive invasion. When it was Adam's turn, he did not pace or raise his voice. He stood still. Meredith handled the legal exposition, citing case law, referencing the chain of ownership, quoting regional zoning standards with emotionless precision. But it was Adam's statement that cut through the room. He didn't talk about laws. He talked about how many days it took him to lay the gravel on his driveway by hand, about how he had moved there for peace, not politics. He described the party, the bounce house, the strangers, the trash left in his bushes. He pointed out that at no point had anyone asked his permission. Not once. He let the silence after that statement hang. It did the work. When he finished, a man in the back, a quiet neighbor who hadn't made his opinion known before, stood and said simply, "He's right. We shouldn't be voting on someone else's yard." That broke the illusion. The committee, sensing the shift in energy, did what committees always do when confronted with conflict too strong to dismiss. They deferred. No ruling was made. The proposal was tabled pending further review, which in municipal language often meant not now and probably never. Adam had won. Not officially, not with a gavel slam or a declaration, but the way real fights were won, through patience, preparation, and quiet, undeniable truth. But that victory didn't end things. It escalated them. 2 days after the hearing, Adam returned home to find someone had dumped a wheelbarrow's worth of mulch at the base of his driveway. Not on the street, not in the middle, but spread deliberately along the shoulder where his signage stood. The marker posts had been pulled from the soil and tossed into the bushes. It was vandalism, but the kind that looked like landscaping if you weren't paying attention. He documented it all, filed another police report, updated Meredith, and replaced the markers with metal stakes driven deeper than before. 3 days later, the chalk drawings returned, but this time on his actual driveway, bold and defiant. Smiling faces, peace signs, the word share drawn in big, crooked letters. He power-washed them silently, then installed a second set of cameras, angled lower, infrared-equipped. Karen didn't speak to him directly, but he could feel her watching. There was a new layer of performance in her interactions. Laughing too loudly near the property line, hosting evening walks with groups of families that just happened to end near his driveway, pointing things out as if giving tours. The next week, his mailbox was left open, stuffed with a stack of flyers for local tutoring services and lawn care offers. It seemed benign until he noticed that half of them had his full name and address handwritten across the top, as if he had requested the information. He hadn't. Then came the email, sent from an anonymous address to several local contacts claiming Adam had made aggressive gestures toward minors on the street. There was no source cited, no event specified, but the implication was toxic. Meredith sprang into action, drafting cease and desist orders, tracing the IP address with the help of a private technician, gathering statements from neighbors who had security cameras proving Adam had been inside his house during the supposed incident. But damage like that didn't need to be proven to hurt. It only needed to be whispered. Social pressure began to tighten like a noose. At the grocery store, a cashier he had spoken to for months barely made eye contact. A neighbor who used to ask for gardening tips now crossed the street when Adam approached. Even the man with the dog, the one who always used to wave, avoided his gaze. Karen never needed to win through legal means. She was trying to suffocate him socially, to isolate him until compliance seemed easier than resistance. But Adam had lived through worse. He had watched a business fall apart from under him. Not because he failed at his work, but because others undercut him with cheaper, faster, worse. He had learned how to rebuild from the rubble, slowly, methodically, without applause. This was just another collapse, this time of trust. He stopped waving first. He began speaking only when spoken to. He withdrew from the street-level politeness that had once formed the thin glue of community, choosing instead the company of silence, of evidence, of preparation. He had Meredith file a civil harassment complaint based on the email, and they included the vandalism, the signage tampering, the false flyers, the deliberate misuse of his name. They knew it wouldn't stick right away, but it was another layer, another signal to the system that this wasn't about one cranky man hoarding gravel. It was about coordinated targeting. But even with the legal measures underway, the psychological pressure persisted. One night, close to midnight, Adam's motion lights triggered. He stepped out and saw nothing. But when he reviewed the footage later, there they were, 2 teenagers on bikes, riding slowly up his driveway, stopping at the end, one of them pulling something from his jacket and tossing it onto the gravel. They left without saying a word. The object turned out to be a small bag of nails, scattered deliberately, not dumped, spaced out for maximum tire damage. He swept them up, bagged them, and submitted them with a time-stamped police report. That was the moment Adam realized they were trying to break his calm. He could feel it in the way small violations multiplied. None catastrophic, but together, corrosive. They wanted him to lash out, to snap, to give them something they could point to as proof that the problem had always been him. But Adam Wallace didn't snap. He adapted. He had a load of gravel delivered, not for the driveway, but to build a low retaining wall between the oaks. Not a fence, not a blockade. Just enough of a separation to reinforce the line. He laid it over 3 days, without rushing, each stone fitted by hand. It wasn't just a wall. It was a boundary made permanent, visible, undeniable. Karen watched from her lawn as he worked, phone in hand, pretending not to record. He didn't acknowledge her. When he finished, he stood at the edge of the drive and looked at what he had made. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't subtle, but it was his. And that was the only thing that mattered. It happened on a Sunday morning, just past 9, under a sky the color of dull aluminum, with rain hanging heavy in the air but refusing to fall. Adam had just finished checking the motion cameras for the week, now a habitual part of his weekend routine, when a series of soft but insistent knocks echoed through the entryway. He opened the door to find a uniformed officer standing on his porch, expression unreadable, holding a folder under one arm and a clipboard in the other. "Mr. Wallace," the officer asked, to which Adam gave a single nod. "We've received a formal complaint," the man continued, alleging harassment and threats made against a minor and several residents in the neighborhood. Adam said nothing at first, not because he was surprised, but because this moment had always been a possibility, one Karen had been preparing in pieces like a mosaic made of lies. "Who filed the complaint?" Adam asked, already knowing the answer. The officer hesitated. "Multiple parties, a petition's attached. They reference a pattern of behavior. One parent claims her daughter was frightened after being yelled at near your driveway. There's also mention of physical obstruction, noise complaints, and alleged aggressive signage." The word "alleged" hung in the air like rot. Adam gestured toward his camera system. "Would you like to see the footage from the past 14 days? Audio and video, high definition, time-stamped." The officer nodded slowly, clearly not expecting the offer. 20 minutes later, they sat side by side in Adam's office watching footage that contradicted every claim. No yelling, no confrontations. Just Adam raking leaves, watering plants, loading soil bags into the truck, nodding once at passers-by. The only raised voices came from children playing on the edge of his property, and even then it was laughter, not fear. When the review ended, the officer looked up and exhaled. "This doesn't match the report." "Of course it doesn't," Adam said. "It was never about truth. It was about creating enough noise to drown out ownership." The officer stood, scratched his head, and said, "I'll have to log everything, but this will go in the file. You may want to consider a formal defamation response." "Already in motion," Adam replied, "but you're welcome to write down the time codes." The officer left a few minutes later, courteous, neutral, but clearly disturbed by what he'd seen. The next day, Meredith filed a temporary restraining order against Karen Longmire, citing malicious coordination of false accusations, evidence tampering, and neighborhood harassment. The petition included 5 attachments: full camera footage, sworn statements from neutral neighbors, a printed copy of the anonymous email smear campaign, and images of tampered property. But the most damning evidence came unexpectedly. That afternoon, a courier arrived with a thick envelope from a local print shop. Inside were copies of the very flyers Karen had denied distributing, traced to a printing request made under her own name and phone number. Someone at the shop, perhaps a reluctant employee, had chosen to send it anonymously. With that, Meredith revised the restraining order into a full civil suit, listing defamation, property interference, and reputational damage. The court hearing was scheduled for 10 days later. In those 10 days, the air on the street changed. No one stood near Adam's wall anymore. Children stopped cutting through his edge walk. The chalk drawings vanished. The dog walkers crossed earlier. Karen's laughter stopped carrying over the fence. For the first time in months, Adam felt the weight of other people's certainty begin to shift. Not toward friendliness, no, that was long gone, but toward caution, the kind that came when the community realized they might have been standing on the wrong side without ever meaning to. On the morning of the court appearance, Adam wore the same slate-gray jacket he'd worn to bid on contracts decades earlier. He didn't want to look like a victim. He wanted to look like a man who knew how to manage boundaries, of property, of principle, of patience. The courthouse was quiet, with pale walls and humming lights and staff who moved without eye contact. Meredith met him near the security line, handing him the updated brief. "We're ready," she said. "They're going to try to argue you're a hostile personality. Don't give them anything. You don't have to win their sympathy. Just keep holding the line." He nodded once. Karen arrived with a lawyer, younger than Meredith, talkative and overly confident. Her smile flickered when she saw Adam but stayed in place. She didn't wave. The judge was sharp-eyed and punctual, and the session began within 15 minutes of docket call. Karen's attorney spoke first, arguing the same tired points about community conflict, mental strain, and the psychological harm caused by an overly territorial neighbor. But the moment Meredith stood and displayed the print receipts, the timestamps and the footage, the energy in the courtroom shifted. The judge frowned. "Did your client not previously deny involvement in these flyers under sworn statement?" Karen's attorney stumbled, tried to redirect, but the damage had landed. Meredith continued, stacking fact upon fact until the opposing counsel's tone began to change. Not argumentative, defensive. In the end, the judge did not issue a full restraining order, but did deliver a firm warning against further interference or false claims. The defamation suit was allowed to proceed, and the court required Karen to submit to a formal deposition with full documentation of all her communications relating to Adam. It wasn't jail. It wasn't dramatic. But it was a public, judicial recognition that lines had been crossed and that there were consequences. Adam didn't smile when he walked out of the courtroom. He didn't raise his head in victory. He simply looked at the sky, noted that the rain had finally begun to fall, and turned toward his truck. That evening, he stood at the edge of the wall he had built, watching as water beaded along the stone and ran in rivulets toward the base. The street was quiet. No one passed. His land was still scarred, tire tracks near the edges, a patch of torn grass where a sign had once stood, but it was whole. He lit a fire in the pit he had built behind the house and sat beside it long after the sky turned black. He didn't drink. He didn't think of revenge. He thought of cedar mulch, of gravel under wheels, of the sound silence made when it was earned back piece by piece. And for the first time in weeks, he heard only that. The weeks that followed the hearing passed not with celebration, but with a kind of quiet recalibration. There were no apologies, no speeches, no neighbor coming to knock on his door with contrition or baked goods. That wasn't how things worked. People who had once stood comfortably on the sidelines now simply stopped making eye contact. Conversations on the sidewalks drifted away when Adam walked past, and the friendly nods of old became tight-lipped acknowledgments or sudden preoccupations with phones. But he didn't care. He hadn't fought to win affection. He had fought to reclaim his ground, his name, and his silence. And in that, he had succeeded. The court date had marked a line in the sand. Karen didn't approach again, not even indirectly. Her walks stopped at the opposite end of the block, and the faux community events she once organized evaporated. The laminated flyers, the petitions, the whispers, they vanished like seasonal noise, leaving only their aftertaste. But Adam knew better than to think it was over. Battles didn't end because one side stopped talking. They ended because the other side stopped trying to push. And pushing, for now, had become too costly for her. Adam spent the following month doing what he did best, building. He wasn't just fixing. He was reinforcing. He added solar floodlights near the back of the property, reinforced the wall's base with another layer of stone, and installed a tall, weathered cedar sign at the entrance, hand-carved and clear. Private property. No access beyond this point. It was more than just a warning. It was a marker, a declaration that the ground beyond it had been defended, not with weapons but with evidence, time, and will. He didn't post cameras as a threat anymore. He posted them as documentation, quiet and indifferent, a watchful eye that saw everything and reacted only when necessary. He had become less visible himself, not hidden but deliberately outside the rhythms of street life. His front yard became denser, more layered with brush and native plants, not as a wall but as a curtain, soft, natural, alive, and impenetrable in its own way. The few neighbors who had supported him during the dispute remained distant, but respectful. Elise, the woman who had offered a witness statement early on, stopped by once with a bag of apples from a nearby farm. She didn't stay long. They didn't talk about Karen, or the hearing, or what the street had become. She just said, "I thought you'd like these." And Adam nodded, grateful not for the fruit but for the quiet gesture of someone willing to stand on a line even if it meant stepping out of comfort. They spoke for a few minutes about pruning trees, weather patterns, and soil depth. And when she left, he felt not warmth exactly but an easing, a reminder that even among cold ground, something rooted could still remain. Karen, meanwhile, grew quieter. Her yard became less decorated, her music less audible. At one point, Adam noticed a "for sale" sign leaning against her garage wall, though it never made it to the lawn. Whether it meant she was planning to leave or merely fantasizing about escape, he didn't know. And it wasn't his concern. He had learned long ago that people like her didn't disappear when defeated. They paused, waited, looked for softer targets. He didn't need her gone to feel at peace. He only needed her to stop acting like his property was an open invitation. By the second month, the tension on the street had settled into something like neutrality. Not harmony, not friendliness, but stasis. No new chalk drawings appeared, no flyers circulated. His driveway remained untouched. The cameras didn't record anything beyond the occasional raccoon or late-night delivery truck. Adam resumed his walks through the orchard path behind the house, pruning what could be saved and accepting what had grown wild beyond recognition. It felt symbolic somehow, this quiet negotiation with what had been neglected, what had survived despite the lack of care, and what still offered fruit if trimmed properly. One afternoon, while replacing a cracked irrigation pipe near the edge of the garden, Adam found an old rusted trowel buried beneath a patch of fern, probably from decades before he'd moved in. It reminded him that land remembered everything. Every footstep, every hand that touched it, every mark made in haste or with intention. It stayed. Covered by time, maybe, but never erased. And if the land could remember, then so could he. Not out of bitterness, but clarity. By the time the legal follow-up concluded, with the defamation case settled quietly out of court, and Karen agreeing not to initiate further community petitions involving his property for the next 5 years, Adam felt no desire to make any statement. About it, there was no victory lap, no announcement, just a piece of paper signed and filed and a weight that finally left his shoulders, not suddenly but piece by piece. He had done what he set out to do, protect what was his, remain civil but unyielding, and remind the people around him, subtly but irrevocably, that kindness and compromise should never be confused with submission. In the end, the land was quiet again, and for Adam Wallace that was the only win that ever mattered.